Zariah Vale thought she was finally meeting the gentle soul who would become her digital anchor at a quiet downtown cafe. Instead, the man who walked through the door was Kang Jae-Ryuk, her ruthless employer and the city's most feared underground crime king. The same man she had been dodging in the hallways of his Clifton mansion for months was the one who had been whispering vulnerable 3 a.m. confessions into her headphones. Judging by the intensity in his gaze, her days of staying invisible were over. If you're hooked on stories about forbidden attraction, virtual romance colliding with a deadly reality, and powerful crime lords who fall impossibly deep, hit that like button. Drop a comment on whether you think Zariah should have stayed to hear the truth or bolted back into the rain, and subscribe for more intoxicating tales of dangerous devotion. 6 months prior, Zariah was barely surviving. Working for Kang Jae-Ryuk was like being trapped in a beautiful, high-tech tomb, elegant, pristine, and absolutely suffocating. He never needed to raise his voice. One look from those cold, narrow eyes could make seasoned executives stutter. Zariah lived by a simple rule: stay invisible. She kept her head down, polished the marble floors of his vast estate, and prayed he would never truly see the woman beneath the modest maid's uniform. Then Shadowkay found her online. It began harmlessly on a photography forum where she shared her secret captures of the city. His comments came first, followed by messages that grew into voice memos stretching long past midnight. He was gentle, hilarious, and shared a crushing isolation that made her heart ache. Zariah tumbled into love with a voice, falling for the vulnerable man who hid behind a screen, never suspecting he was the monster she feared by day. "Meet me," he had texted the day before. "I need to know this is as real as it feels, Zariah." There she stood, her pulse racing and wearing her best dress, waiting to finally see the face of her salvation. The cafe door swung open, and the world seemed to freeze. Instead of a sweet stranger, the man who made the whole city tremble walked in. Kang Jae-Ryuk sat across from his maid, placed his phone on the table, and revealed the Shadowkay profile logged into the screen. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Zariah," he murmured, his voice that same low, melodic rasp she had fallen for online. "Or are you just disappointed that your digital soulmate is the same monster who signs your paycheck?" In the weeks leading up to that rainy cafe revelation, Zariah Vale's existence was split between two irreconcilable worlds. By day, she was a ghost in a maid's uniform, a blur of movement through the vast, cold corridors of the Kang estate. Her life was a rhythmic cycle of polishing marble floors and ensuring the high-tech mansion remained as pristine and suffocating as its owner. She moved with a fragile elegance, her eyes always downcast, carefully dodging the path of Kang Jae-Ryuk. To her, he was the crime king, a man of ice-cold gazes whose dragon tattoo was a silent warning of the lethal power he wielded. Every time his polished shoes clicked against the stone near her, her heart would hammer against her ribs, her only goal to remain invisible. But the moment the sun dipped below the horizon and the mansion fell into a heavy, watchful silence, Zariah's true life began. Tucked into the narrow bed of her servants' quarters, she would press her headphones to her ears, the glowing screen of her phone her only light. In this digital sanctuary, the monster who made executives stutter was replaced by Shadowkay. The messages were her solace, often arriving at 3 a.m. when the rest of the world was asleep. Far from the ruthless commander who barely spoke 3 words to his staff, Shadowkay was gentle and hilariously self-deprecating. He would send her snippets of his day, a blurred photo of a stray cat he'd found near a shipyard, or a sarcastic remark about a mind-numbing meeting that had lasted 4 hours too long. Zariah would find herself grinning, stupidly, in the dark, typing back stories about her own passion for photography, never dreaming the man she was falling for was the same one whose coffee she served with trembling hands every morning. There were moments of intoxicating intimacy that felt more real than the stone walls surrounding her. Once, Shadowkay had sent a voice memo, his low, melodic rasp heavy with a crushing isolation. He spoke of a crown he never wanted, and a life where everyone saw him as death incarnate. Zariah had listened to it 3 times, her heart aching for the stranger who felt as trapped as she did. She had replied with a photo of the moonlight hitting the estate's fountain, calling it a silver lining in a dark place. She didn't know that just floors above her, Kang Jae-Ryuk was staring at that same fountain, holding his phone as if it were a lifeline, intense and searching for the woman who made him want to be human again. The dramatic irony of her life was a twisted game she wasn't aware she was playing. By day, she starved for a kind word from her employer. By night, she was his salvation. This virtual romance was a beautiful mistake, a bridge built between a maid and a king over a sea of secrets. But as the messages grew more vulnerable and the 3 a.m. confessions turned into promises of a meeting, the invisible wall between her two worlds began to crumble. The overwhelming silence of the cafe was shattered as Zariah bolted from her chair, her best dress catching on the table as she scrambled toward the exit. The reveal had been too much. The virtual soulmate who had been her salvation was the same monster who made the city tremble. She burst into the unforgiving soul rain, her sneakers splashing through puddles as she tried to outrun the brutal truth. Her mind was a chaos of betrayal. She had shared her most vulnerable 3 a.m. confessions with a man she was terrified to look at in the hallways. Zariah, stop. The low melodic rasp of Kang Jae-Ryuk cut through the rhythmic drumming of the storm. She didn't stop until she reached the shadowy alleyway behind the cafe, her lungs forgetting how to function as she spun around to face him. Jae-Ryuk was right behind her, his lean, fit physique tensed, his black dress shirt clinging to his tattooed skin as the rain soaked him through. "I quit," she choked out, her voice cracking with anguish. "I can't go back to the mansion. I can't look at you knowing you were. You were Shadow K all along. You played a twisted game with me." Jae-Ryuk stepped into her space, his intense, observant gaze fixing on her vibrant face with a possessive yet protective urgency. He didn't use violence, but his controlled authority blocked her path as he covered the distance between them. It wasn't a game. He whispered against the rain, his sharp jawline tightening in a show of unwavering honesty. "I hid the truth because I was starved for someone to see me, Zariah. Just me. Not the crime king or the monster with the dragon tattoo. I knew if I told you who I was, you wouldn't see the man who loves photography. You'd only see death incarnate." Zariah stumbled back, her shoulders slightly drawn inward as she looked at his extensive tattoos, and then back into the eyes of the man she had tumbled into love with. The irony was a physical blow. The most feared man in the city was trembling with the fear of her rejection. "You lied to me for months," she gasped, her expressive eyes searching his for a miraculous sign of the gentle stranger. "I gave you my 3 a.m. confessions because you were the only sanctuary I had left," Jae-Ryuk commanded softly, reaching out to cup her face with a tattooed hand. "I am completely in love with the woman who wasn't afraid to talk to me in the dark. Don't run back into the rain, Zariah. Stay and help me unmask the rest of this beautiful mistake." The overwhelming silence of the alleyway was charged with restrained attraction and lethal stakes. Zariah looked at his ink and then at his vulnerable expression, realizing her running days were truly over. The fragile peace of the rainy confrontation was shattered by a sound more violent than the storm, the sharp, staccato crack of a high-caliber rifle echoing through the narrow alleyway. Kang Jae-Ryuk didn't hesitate. He reacted with a lethal instinct born of a life spent in the lion's den, spinning Zariah around and shielding her with his lean, fit physique, as a second bullet sparked against the brick wall behind them. A muffled groan escaped his full lips as he staggered, a dark, spreading stain quickly, suffocating the pristine white of his shirt where the lead had torn through his shoulder. "Jae-Ryuk!" Zariah's voice was a shrill gasp of horror as she caught his weight, her hands trembling as they pressed against the warm, slick reality of his blood. The crime king was wounded, the absolute dominance he usually projected flickering for a vulnerable second as he leaned heavily into her. In the chaos of the next few minutes, his security men and bodyguards appeared from the shadows, their rhythmic movements a blur of controlled danger as they secured the perimeter and manhandled their boss into the back of a sleek, expensive black sedan. "Go home, Zariah," Jae-Ryuk managed to rasp, his narrow eyes hazy with pain but still searching her face for salvation. "If you stay, you aren't just a maid anymore. You become a target. My rivals will unmask you to destroy me. But the woman who had spent months falling for the gentle soul of Shadowkay couldn't bolt back into the safety of her invisible life. The betrayal she had felt in the cafe was erased by the sight of the monster who had just used his body as her shield. Zariah didn't pester his men for permission. She simply climbed into the car beside him, her expressive eyes flashing with a fierce, new conviction. "I'm not running," she whispered, covering his uninjured hand with hers as the car sped toward a private medical facility. For the next 48 hours, she refused to leave his bedside. She watched the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, her gaze lingering on the elegant black ink dragon that seemed to pulse with every heartbeat. She sat through the overwhelming silence of the hospital room, dodging the concerned looks of his tech experts and lieutenants. By staying, she had transitioned from his employee to his weakness, a beautiful mistake that the city's underground would soon try to exploit. Zariah was no longer just a maid. She was the target, entangled in a lethal world where her only sanctuary was the very man who brought the danger. The overwhelming silence of the private medical ward was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic hum of monitors and the soft patter of rain against the glass. Kang Jae-Ryuk lay against the sterile white pillows, his lean, fit physique looking uncharacteristically vulnerable beneath the hospital linens. The absolute dominance he usually projected had been erased by the pain of the rival hit, leaving behind the man Zariah had come to know as Shadowkay. Zariah sat by his bedside, her large almond-shaped eyes watching the way his inked hand twitched in his sleep. When he finally opened his narrow eyes, they weren't filled with the ice-cold authority that made executives stutter. Instead, they were hollowed and searching. He looked at Zariah, his low, melodic rasp barely a whisper in the quiet of the room. "You should have bolted, Zariah," he murmured, his sharp jawline tightening with a vivid sense of guilt. "I told you I was death incarnate. This syndicate legacy is a lethal weight, and now I've entangled you in it." Zariah didn't pull away. She covered his hand with hers, her fragile elegance a stark contrast to the elegant black ink dragon rising along his neck. "I didn't stay for the crime king, Jae-Ryuk. I stayed for the man who sent me 3 a.m. voice memos about his crushing isolation." Jae-Ryuk let out a hollow breath, his intense, observant gaze turning toward the window. "I was 23 when my father died. I was a wealthy engineer's son with a passion for photography and a core of steel that I wanted to use for something legitimate." He gasped slightly as he shifted his weight, the brutal truth of his life unmasking itself in the shadowy room. "I never wanted this dark crown. I dreamed of capturing the city through a lens, not commanding it through total surveillance and violence." He spoke of the suffocating pressure to maintain his persona, the way he had to manhandle his own dreams to protect the organization he had inherited. To the world, he was a ruthless and intimidating monster, but in the 3 a.m. confessions he sent to Zariah, he was just a starved soul seeking salvation. "The day I found your photos on that art forum, it was like someone finally unmasked the world for me again," he whispered against the silence, his hand lingering on hers. "You saw the miraculous beauty in things I had discarded. You were the first person who didn't beg for my favor or tremble at my name." Zariah felt her heart ache for the king who lived in a lion's den of his own making. The dramatic irony of their lives was intoxicating. She had been an invisible maid, polishing his floors, while he had been a hunted soul seeking refuge in her vision. "I want to transition away from this, Zariah," Jae-Ryuk said, his voice turning to steel with a new conviction. "I want to reclaim the man who loved photography. I want to build a legitimate future where we aren't hiding in the shadows." But the brutal truth remained. He was still the target, and their virtual romance had collided with a deadly reality. As the 90 seconds of chaos approached, the king's burden was no longer just his own. It was a lethal legacy that Zariah had chosen to share. The overwhelming silence of the private medical ward was shattered with a violence that made the sanctuary feel like a grave. It began with the rhythmic, heavy thud of automatic doors being kicked open, followed by the lethal crack of a silenced pistol. Zariah Vale, who had been searching Jae-Ryuk's face for a sign of awakening, felt her heart bolt into her throat as 5 armed men in shadowy, tactical gear flooded the room. Their goal was clear: to destroy everything he loves and end the crime king's reign while he was at his most vulnerable. "Get down!" Jae-Ryuk's voice was a low, melodic rasp, raw with anguish, as he manhandled his wounded body out of the bed. Despite the brutal truth of his fresh stitches and the suffocating pain radiating from his shoulder, his lethal instincts remained unyielding. In one fluid, calculating motion, he yanked Zariah toward the floor, covering her small frame with his own. He became a shield of ink and absolute dominance, his lean, fit physique absorbing the impact of a stray bullet meant for her. The next 90 seconds were a chaos of shattered glass and unspoken terror. Bullets cracked into the medical monitors, sending sparks through the dim room while Zariah huddled beneath him, her hands trembling against the elegant black ink dragon on his neck. She could feel the rhythmic thud of his heart against her back, a possessive yet protective beat that proved he was the man who would watch the city burn before allowing her to be harmed. Jae-Ryuk reached for a concealed weapon he had hidden beneath the pillow, his narrow eyes flashing with a fierce and lethal intensity. Even barely surviving his own injuries, he returned fire with a controlled danger that made the street thugs hesitate. The air turned antiseptic and bitter with the scent of gun oil and distressed ozone. Just as quickly as the hospital breach had begun, Jae-Ryuk's security men and bodyguards arrived, manhandling the intruders into the shadowy hallway. The 90 seconds of chaos ended as abruptly as they had started, leaving the room in a state of hollowed ruin. Jae-Ryuk collapsed back against the cold floor, his sharp jawline tightening as he gasped for air, but his first intense look was for Zariah. "Are you safe?" he murmured, his hand lingering on her hair with a vivid tenderness. Zariah looked at the monster, who had just nearly erased his own life to save hers, and for the first time she didn't want to stay invisible. She realized that her running days were over. She was entangled in his world, and there was no sanctuary she wanted more than his broad shoulders. The official car wound through the jagged mountain passes of the interior, leaving the neon lights and lethal chaos of the city far behind. They arrived at a shadowy clifftop fortress hidden deep within the forest, a minimalist masterpiece that served as Kang Jae-Ryuk's most private sanctuary. Here, the overwhelming silence was not suffocating, but a miraculous shield against the syndicate legacy that sought to destroy them. Late that night, under the dim, amber glow of a lunar eclipse, Zariah Vale and Jae-Ryuk sat on a wide stone terrace overlooking the rain-streaked canopy. The air was antiseptic and cold, yet the intense connection between them generated a warmth that made the hospital breach feel like a hollowed memory. Jae-Ryuk sat with his fitted black dress shirt unbuttoned, his lean, fit physique relaxed for the first time in months. Zariah leaned in, her expressive eyes tracing the ink that spiraled across his skin. With a trembling hand, she reached out to touch the elegant black ink dragon rising along his neck. Her fingertips followed the rhythmic lines of the scales, searching for the man who was Shadow-K beneath the skin of the crime king. "Each mark is a brutal truth of the life I was forced to claim," Jae-Ryuk murmured, his low, melodic rasp vibrating in the quiet. "This dragon, it's a crown I never wanted. It's death incarnate to the world, but to you, I want it to be nothing more than art." Zariah didn't bolt or pull away. Instead, she covered his hand with hers, her fragile elegance grounding his absolute dominance. In the overwhelming silence of the forest, they shared unspoken vulnerabilities, unmasking the dreams they had once only dared to whisper through 3 a.m. voice memos. For a vivid moment, the maid and the monster were simply two souls seeking salvation. "I want to transition away from the blood, Zariah," he gasped softly, his narrow eyes catching the moonlight. "I want to build a legitimate future where you are my equal, not an invisible shadow. I want to erase the crime king and just be the man who loves your photographs." Zariah leaned into the warmth of his broad shoulders, realizing her running days were truly over. They were entangled in a lethal world, but as she traced the ink of his past, she knew they would face it together. The fragile sanctuary of the mountain safe house was shattered not by gunfire, but by the silent, lethal vibration of a phone against a marble countertop. Kang Yi-ryuk's intense, observant gaze darkened as he scrolled through the morning's headlines, his sharp jawline tightening with a furious desperation. A trusted lieutenant, a man who had stood by Yi-ryuk through years of syndicate legacy, had committed the ultimate inner betrayal. "Zariah," Yi-ryuk murmured, his low melodic rasp heavy with a crushing isolation. Zariah Vale walked into the room, her fragile elegance a stark contrast to the shadowy tension radiating from her employer. He turned the screen toward her, revealing the brutal truth that had already begun to circulate through every major news outlet in the city. There, in high-resolution clarity, were candid photographs of her, not as the invisible maid in her modest uniform, but as the woman who had sat under the moonlight, tracing the ink of the crime king's dragon tattoo. The annexation of her privacy was complete. The unmasking of the mystery maid had destroyed Zariah's anonymity in a single 90-second news cycle. She was no longer a ghost in the hallways. She was now famous, her face tangled together with the city's most ruthless underground figure for the whole world to see. "They know who I am," Zariah gasped, her expressive eyes wide with a vivid terror as she realized the stark reality. "I can't go back to being invisible. Everyone knows I'm your weakness." Yi-ryuk stood, his lean, fit physique blocking the light as he covered the distance to her. His tattooed hands cupped her face with a possessive yet protective urgency, but his narrow eyes were hollowed with guilt. He had tried to be her protector, but his dangerous underground kingpin status had instead turned her into a permanent target for every rival seeking to destroy everything he loved. "This was orchestrated to pull me back into the lion's den," Yi-ryuk commanded softly, though his voice cracked with anguish. "By leaking these, they've made you entangled in a lethal game you never asked to play. My running days might be over, but I've just erased your safety." Zariah looked at the photos, the beautiful mistake of their virtual romance now laid bare for a predatory public. The intoxicating intimacy they had shared in the forest sanctuary was now a lethal weapon in the hands of his enemies. As the tech experts in the next room scrambled to unmask the source of the leak, Zariah felt the suffocating weight of the crime king's crown beginning to press down on her own head. Their sanctuary was no longer a safe house, it was a target. The overwhelming silence of the mountain safe house had become a lethal weapon, sharper than any shattered glass from the hospital breach. In the wake of the inner betrayal, Kang Yi-ryuk retreated behind the ice-gold mask of the crime king, his sharp jawline set in a line of unwavering honesty that felt more like a brutal truth. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his intense, observant gaze fixed on the shadowy forest, realizing that his love had become Zariah's greatest danger. "You have to leave, Zariah," he murmured, his low melodic rasp vibrating with a hollowed finality. Zariah Vale, standing in the center of the minimalist living area, felt a tremor of anguish surge through her fragile elegance. "You're pushing me away to protect me, after everything, after the 3 a.m. confessions and the 90 seconds of chaos." "I am death incarnate to the world, Zariah," Yi-ryuk commanded softly, turning to face her with narrow eyes that were searching for the strength to let her go. "The press has unmasked you. My rivals see you as a target to destroy me. If you stay entangled in my syndicate legacy, I will eventually be the reason you are erased." He moved toward her, his tattooed hand lingering near her cheek but never making contact, a restrained attraction that was now suffocating. This was a beautiful mistake, a virtual romance that should have stayed in the shadows. "My security men will manhandle your relocation to a safe country. You will be invisible again. You will be saved." "I don't want to be invisible anymore," Zariah gasped, her expressive eyes wide with vivid defiance. "I'd rather face the danger of your world than the monstrous isolation of a life without you." But Yi-ryuk's absolute dominance was unyielding. He commanded his bodyguards to prepare the official car, his shoulders slightly drawn inward as he watched her manhandled into a shattered silence. As the car pulled smoothly away, Zariah looked through the tinted windows at the lion's den she was being discarded from. The separation was hollow, leaving Zariah barely surviving in a sterile and unforgiving anonymity across the sea. Back in Seoul, Jae-Ryuk sat in his Clifton mansion, surrounded by total surveillance and an overwhelming silence that erased his salvation. He had transitioned her to safety, but in doing so, he had condemned himself to the monster he never wanted to be. The monstrous isolation of the past 6 months had turned the clifftop mansion into a sterile and unforgiving tomb for Kang Jae-Ryuk. He had erased Zariah from his physical world to ensure her safety, but her memory remained an intense connection he couldn't sever. He had spent every waking hour dismantling his syndicate legacy, transitioning his vast operations into legitimate art importing and real estate ventures. He was no longer the crime king the city feared. He was a man unmasking a new destiny, yet he felt hollowed without his salvation. Zariah Vale, however, was done being invisible. She bolted from her safe haven across the sea, realizing that safety without Jae-Ryuk was just another form of suffocating imprisonment. She returned to Seoul not as a maid, but as his equal, ready to choose the danger of his love over the anonymity of a life apart. The reveal occurred at the same downtown cafe where their virtual romance had first collided with reality. Jae-Ryuk sat at their table, his sharp jawline set in a line of unwavering honesty, when the door swung open. He didn't see a ghost. He saw Zariah, her expressive eyes flashing with a vivid and fierce conviction as she walked toward him. "I'm not running anymore, Jae-Ryuk," she whispered, her fragile elegance now backed by a core of steel. Jae-Ryuk stood, his lean, fit physique trembling with restrained emotion as he covered the distance to her. He didn't push her away this time. Instead, he cupped her face with his tattooed hands, his narrow eyes, searching hers for forgiveness. "I've erased the monster, Zariah," he murmured, his low, melodic rasp thick with anguish and hope. "The empire is legitimate. The running days for both of us are over." He produced a small box and swung it open, revealing a ring that caught the neon lights of the cafe. "Will you marry the man who finally learned how to be human through your lens? Will you stay and build a miraculous future with me?" Zariah leaned into the warmth of his broad shoulders, a genuine smile transforming her face. "Yes," she breathed, the overwhelming silence of their past finally replaced by a vivid promise of forever. The reformed king and his right-hand queen had claimed their sanctuary, no longer hunted by the shadows, but shining in the light of their own intoxicating devotion.